The new head of the UN has called for 2017 to be a year for peace. But with no clear strategies for Syria or tackling global terror, we'll ask if the modern world is too divided for the United Nations. I'm Dana Lewis. This is Insight. Welcome to Insight. The United Nations was formed in the aftermath of the Second World War. Its mission to maintain international peace and develop cooperation. And now, 72 years on, its 193 member states have failed to end the 5-year conflict in Syria or find a way to tackle global terrorism. The UN now has a new boss. Secretary General Antonio Guterres officially took over from Ban Ki-moon on January the 1st, pledging to make 2017 a year for peace. But that might seem unlikely given the challenges facing the organization, with critics arguing that it simply no longer works. In this program, we'll examine the UN's effectiveness and ask if it's fit for purpose. And we are joined now from New York by Jan Eliasson, who is Deputy Secretary General of the UN until last week, under the outgoing Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General. Sir, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. What do you expect from your new boss, Mr. Guterres, as he takes over the helm at the UN?
We are faced with a number of crises in the world that certainly don't end. In the political area, we have mainly the Syria nightmare with all its ramifications and implications. In the development field, we have a little bit of good news with the basis laid for a new direction for development, sustainable development, and hopefully member states supporting that road ahead of us. On the area of human rights, we have huge problems, I would say, and also respect to international humanitarian law. So certainly Mr. Guterres is facing a number of important challenges, but my view is, of course, that United Nations is indispensable when it comes to dealing with global issues of national concern.
You mentioned Syria. Certainly that's going to be one of the first things on his desk. And a lot of people would say, why has the UN failed so miserably to help people who are suffering from the war and bring about some sort of political solution in Syria?
Well, I'm the first one to say that the Syria tragedy is a collective failure for the parties on the ground in Syria, but also for the international community. We have been left with dealing with the situation without a strong, unified Security Council resolution as a basis for our work. And we have been left to deal with the humanitarian consequences of this horror. We have had the best negotiators you can imagine, Kofi Annan, Lakhdar Brahimi, Staffan de Mistura, trying to deal with this, but only about a year ago we finally got a Security Council resolution. It worked for some time. We had a cessation of hostilities that was a bit fragile but still held. We delivered humanitarian assistance to hundreds of thousands of people. We lifted sieges in several parts of Syria. But then the escalation, military escalation continued, and now the situation is extremely somber.
400,000 dead, 100,000 trapped, and the UN Security Council is apparently just paralyzed. And has it failed now to function as a proper mechanism at the UN, as something that has to be overhauled or replaced?
Well, certainly there is a failure when it comes to Syria. You have the veto or the threat of veto stopping action. And unfortunately, there are still those who believe in a military victory, and they haven't chosen the road of political solution. United Nations is tied up when we don't have that basis for our work. So I wish we had had a Security Council resolution back in 2012, when Kofi Annan negotiated the formula in Geneva. But unfortunately, that was not the case. Now, 4 years later, we have a situation where ISIS has grown up as a huge factor in the whole region. They didn't even exist. They did not exist in 2012. And we have the need for a solution both between Russia and the US and countries in the region like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Qatar. And then, of course, you know that the opposition now is also helped militarily by extremist groups.
Okay,
So
we understand the problem, but what is the
desperate
solution?
situation that we have is a result
it a
of not
fundamental
acting early.
core problem with the structure of the UN, or is the UN a victim of this increasing polarization between countries, and there's nothing that the UN can't bridge those differences between Russia and other countries that are trying to solve this now?
You know, we have to understand that you have to make a distinction between the world as it is and the world as it should be. The world as it is that you cannot have a solution on this issue unless you have agreements among major powers in the world and the countries in the region and the parties on the ground. UN is a mirror of this. We are constantly reminding of the solution that we could present. You could easily have a solution if all sides now agreed to stop the fighting and B, start to give humanitarian access to all parts of Syria, and thirdly, get back to Geneva and start a discussion which should lead to a political transition.
So are you encouraged by the words of Donald Trump, who says, let's start talking to Russia, let's just focus on dealing with Daesh or ISIS, as you call them, and try to work out something with Russia? Are you encouraged by that, or do you think Trump is naive?
No, that's not what I was saying. I was saying that we need to do this together with the parties on the ground, with the countries in the region, and with the Security Council members. The model is to get going to reach the de-escalation and the beginning of political talks. What needs to be done, certainly at the same time, is dealing with terrorism, which is a problem which everybody unites around. But we cannot only focus on that. We need to make the parties go to the negotiation table and start a discussion about real political transition.
While we're mentioning the president-elect Donald Trump, now you have him saying he may cancel the Paris Accords on global warming. He's just appointed a new member to run the EPA who is hostile to environmental legislation. Are you discouraged by that?
I am concerned that we don't face up to the fact that climate change is an existential issue for all of us on this earth. And the great progress that we made last year, both on the Sustainable Development Goals and through the Paris Agreement on climate change, are tremendously important, almost historic achievements. I would hope that the realities on the ground, the floods, the droughts, the rising sea levels, are proof enough that we need to do something very soon to keep that track. I would hope that the enlightened self-interest would lead all nations to realize that we, for our children and grandchildren, have to take climate change seriously.
I want to ask you about the UN. You're leaving, and I hope that you'll be very frank and honest with us. A lot of people say the UN is due repeatedly for a major overhaul, that it's bloated, it's overfunded, it concentrates on head office considerations, it's very slow to move in the field and work. Do you think that it's time to relook at this very important world organization that a lot of people say has become paralyzed and ineffective in different areas of the world?
A fair question, but if you accept my description a while ago that United Nations is a mirror of the world as it is, so what you are actually expressing is the frustration about the state of affairs in today's world. Today's world is getting so complicated, the issues become so complex, for instance, by the strongly growing element of dividing nations, people into ethnic groups, religious groups, tribal groups, and by that making dialogue so much more difficult. We have to make the case better from the side of the United Nations that international cooperation is in the national interest of member states. On the political side, we have seen very negative developments, not least made more difficult to solve by these ethnic and religious elements. But I think in the end, if you were to abolish the UN, some of us would meet tomorrow to create a new one. And it is, after all, the aspirations and dreams of the world to use the UN, and we are ready to. We are a tool, but we are as strong as the member states want us to be.
The UN just shouldn't be a reflecting of the world situation, but you should be leading us out of that. Is the UN able to do that?
I hope the UN would do that. We have led the way now on development, sustainable development and climate. That's the good news last year, for instance. On the political front, I must admit failure, but because the Security Council is not unified. I think the Security Council members have to realize if they have the veto power, they have a gift in their hand. They should not use the veto as much as they do. They should accept that the Security Council is a negotiation body. It is the difficulties in the Council that make it difficult for us to act on Syria, which was one of our greatest failures. But I would hope that we can be accepted as having that leadership role. You can't look at the United Nations as something idealistic up there. It should be a tool for their own national interests.
As you leave the UN, what would you say has been its top success? And I know there's a long list of things that you may refer to, but in limited time, what would you say is sort of your headline in terms of what the UN has been able to accomplish?
Well, I've mentioned already the climate change agreement, but I want to say something which is very close to my heart. We need to act early. We are far too late in our reactions. We pay an enormous price for waiting for the last moment. We pay $22 billion for humanitarian operations in the world, crisis situations. We pay $8.5 billion every year for peacekeeping. We need to understand that we have to get in early when we hear the first vibrations in the ground about conflict. And the first vibrations very often are human rights violations. Why should we wait for the atrocities to occur when we could act on the early stage of human rights violations? In Syria, countries are fighting out their own problems inside Syrian borders. It is at the early stages that we can act. If, as I said earlier, we had had a Security Council resolution on Syria in the summer of 2012, when ISIS did not exist, and there was an orderly opposition, we would have a different thing. So my experience is get in there early. Listen to the vibrations, act then, and don't pay the price later on in this horrible situation, and also hurting the reputation of the UN.
Jan Eliasson, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, it's a great pleasure talking to you, and we appreciate your reflection and wisdom today. This is Insight. Coming up, we'll speak to the UK's former representative to the UN, a man who's been to more than 150 meetings of the Security Council.